Joseph stepped onto his terrace one morning and froze. 4 young bobcats were huddled near the stairwell, mud-soaked, exhausted, and unable to move properly after a powerful cyclone tore through the city and nearby scrubland. He did what he could to help them recover, and when they were strong enough, the bobcats returned back into the wild. Joseph thought that was the end of it. But then something inexplicable began to happen. More wild bobcats started appearing on his property. Not the same ones. Different bobcats, all somehow knowing this was sanctuary. And it was only the beginning. Nature had one final surprise in store. One secret that wouldn't reveal itself until 8 years later. Watch what happens when these wild predators return the favor. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning sun had barely crested the Catalina Mountains when Joseph Seeker stepped onto his back terrace, coffee mug in hand, expecting nothing more than the familiar quiet of another desert dawn. The previous night's storm had been unlike anything Tucson had seen in decades. A rare cyclone that had barreled through the Sonoran scrubland with terrifying force, uprooting saguaros that had stood for 200 years and turning dry washes into raging rivers of mud and debris. Joseph had spent most of the night listening to the wind howl against his modest adobe home, watching through rain-streaked windows as lightning illuminated the chaos outside. Now, in the storm's aftermath, the desert looked wounded. Branches littered his yard. His neighbor's fence had collapsed. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear the wail of sirens responding to emergencies across the city. But it was what he saw on his own terrace that stopped him cold. 4 small bodies huddled together against the stairwell leading down to his backyard. Spotted coats matted with mud, ears flattened, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. At first, Joseph's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. They looked almost like house cats, but something was different. The tufted ears, the distinctive spots, the way they pressed together in a tight formation, as if drawing strength from one another's presence. Bobcats. 4 young bobcats. Probably no more than 4 or 5 months old. Joseph's heart clenched in his chest. In his 62 years of living on the edge of this desert neighborhood, he had seen bobcats before. Fleeting shadows crossing his property at dusk, occasional paw prints in the soft earth near his bird feeder. But never like this. Never this close. Never this vulnerable. He stood perfectly still, barely breathing, watching as 8 golden eyes tracked his every movement. The largest of the 4, a female, Joseph guessed, based on her slightly smaller build but protective positioning in front of her siblings, let out a low, warning growl. But there was no strength behind it, just fear. "Easy now," Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not going to hurt you." He took one slow step backward, then another, until he was pressed against the glass door leading into his kitchen. The bobcats watched him retreat but made no move to flee. They couldn't, Joseph realized with a sinking feeling. They were too exhausted, too weak. Whatever ordeal the storm had put them through, separation from their mother, hours of fighting against wind and water, the terror of their world being torn apart around them, had left them with nothing. Joseph thought about what he should do. The logical thing would be to call Arizona Game and fish. Let the professionals handle it. That's what any sensible person would do when confronted with wild predators on their property, even young ones. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way the smallest one, a male with a distinctive white patch on his chest, kept blinking slowly, fighting to stay awake. Maybe it was the memory of his own children, now grown and scattered across the country, and how he would have wanted someone to help them if they'd ever been lost and frightened. Or maybe it was simply the quiet knowledge that had settled into his bones over 6 decades of desert living, that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the logical thing. Joseph backed into his kitchen, set down his coffee, and began to think. The first thing he did was fill a shallow bowl with clean water. Not too much. He didn't want to risk them drinking too fast and making themselves sick. He placed it on the terrace about 15 feet from where the Bobcats huddled, moving slowly and deliberately, narrating his actions in a soft, steady voice. "Just some water," he said, as if the animals could understand him. "That's all, just water. You take your time." He retreated back inside and watched through the window. For nearly an hour, none of the Bobcats moved. Joseph began to worry that they were too far gone, that whatever strength they'd had left had been spent just getting to his terrace. But then the smallest one stirred. The little male with the white patch lifted his head, nostrils twitching. Slowly, painfully, he began to crawl toward the bowl, his siblings watching with a mixture of caution and desperate hope. When he reached the water and began to lap at it with weak, unsteady movements, Joseph felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "That's it," he whispered. "Good boy. Good boy." Over the next hour, all 4 Bobcats made their way to the water bowl, taking turns drinking while the others kept watch. Joseph replenished it twice, each time moving a little more quickly, testing their tolerance. By the 3rd time, the female barely flinched when he approached. For food, Joseph was less certain. He knew Bobcats were carnivores, but he wasn't sure what would be safe or appropriate for young ones in their condition. He settled on raw chicken from his refrigerator, plain, unseasoned, cut into small pieces that wouldn't be difficult for weakened jaws to manage. He placed the food near the water and retreated again to his kitchen window. The Bobcats ate ravenously. That first day established a pattern that would continue for nearly 2 weeks. Joseph would wake before dawn, check on his visitors through the window, then prepare water and food. He never approached closer than 10 feet. He never made sudden movements or loud noises. He never tried to touch them or interact with them beyond what was necessary for their survival. "You're not their friend," he reminded himself constantly. "You're just the guy who leaves food, that's all." But as the days passed, something shifted. The Bobcats began to recognize him, not just his presence, but his routine. They would watch for him in the mornings, their ears perking up at the sound of his back door opening. The female, whom Joseph had privately started calling Boss because of her protective leadership of the group, would sometimes make a soft chirping sound when she saw him, a vocalization that didn't seem aggressive or fearful. Their recovery was remarkable to witness. The mud dried and fell away from their coats, revealing the beautiful spotted patterns underneath. Their eyes, which had been dull and glazed with exhaustion, began to shine with the bright, alert intelligence that Bobcats were known for. They started moving around the terrace, exploring its corners, batting at leaves that blew across the stone surface. Joseph documented everything with his camera. Photography had been his hobby for decades, mostly landscapes and desert wildlife from a distance. But he had never captured anything like this. The images showed the transformation in vivid detail. 4 frightened survivors becoming 4 healthy, curious young Bobcats. He showed the photos to no one. He wasn't sure why, exactly. Maybe he was afraid that sharing the story would somehow break the spell. Or maybe he just wanted to keep this strange, beautiful experience to himself for a little while longer. On the 9th day, Joseph came out to find only 3 bobcats on his terrace. His heart lurched with fear before he spotted the missing one, the smallest male, the one with the white patch, exploring the abandoned lot next door. The little bobcat moved through the scrubby vegetation with growing confidence, pouncing on insects and batting at the seed heads of dried grass. Joseph watched him through his binoculars, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "Look at you," he murmured, "getting your strength back." Over the following days, the bobcats' explorations expanded. They would disappear into the surrounding desert for hours at a time, then return to the terrace as evening fell, settling into their familiar huddle near the stairwell. Joseph continued to leave food and water, but he noticed they were eating less of what he provided. They were learning to hunt on their own. It was bittersweet. Joseph knew this was exactly what was supposed to happen, that his role had always been temporary, a bridge between crisis and recovery. But he couldn't help feeling a growing attachment to these 4 wild creatures who had stumbled into his life. He wasn't the only one who had noticed them. Margaret Wilson had lived next door to Joseph for 12 years, and in all that time, they had maintained the cordial but distant relationship common to neighbors in this part of Tucson. She was a retired real estate agent in her late 50s, meticulous about her property and deeply invested in the neighborhood's reputation. She approached Joseph one afternoon as he was checking his mailbox, her expression tight with concern. "Joseph, we need to talk about what's been going on at your place." Joseph felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "The bobcats." Margaret lowered her voice as if the word itself was dangerous. "I've seen them on your terrace, multiple times, and I've seen you feeding them." "They were hurt," Joseph said carefully, "displaced by the storm. I've just been giving them some space to recover." "Giving them space? Joseph, you're encouraging them. You're teaching wild animals that human homes are safe places to be. Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" "They're young," Joseph said. "They needed help." "They're predators," Margaret countered. "I have grandchildren who visit. Mrs. Patterson walks her toy poodle past your house every morning. What happens when one of those bobcats decides that a small dog or a toddler looks like prey?" Joseph wanted to argue, but he could see the genuine fear in Margaret's eyes. She wasn't being malicious. She was scared. "I'm going to have to report this," Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. "I'm sorry, Joseph. I really am. But I can't in good conscience stay quiet about something that could endanger the neighborhood." The call from Arizona Game and Fish came 2 days later. Officer David Reyes was professional but firm when he arrived at Joseph's home. He inspected the terrace, took photographs of the areas where Joseph had been leaving food, and asked detailed questions about the bobcats' behavior and Joseph's interactions with them. "I understand you were trying to help," Officer Reyes said, his tone not unkind. "And honestly, from what you're describing, you probably did save their lives. Young bobcats separated from their mother during a storm like that. Their survival rate isn't good." "But?" Joseph asked, already knowing what was coming. "But you can't keep feeding them. You can't encourage them to stay. Wild animals that become habituated to humans, that start associating people with food, they become problems. And when bobcats become problems, there's usually only one solution." The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and terrible. "I'm not going to cite you this time," Officer Reyes continued, "but I need you to stop. No more food, no more water. Let them move on naturally. If they come back after you stop feeding them, give us a call and we'll assess whether they need to be relocated." Joseph nodded numbly. I understand. After Officer Reyes left, Joseph sat on his terrace for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the desert. The Bobcats hadn't appeared that day. They'd been spending more and more time away from his property as their strength and confidence grew. Maybe, he thought, they were already preparing to leave. Maybe his role in their story was already ending, and the officer's warning was just the universe's way of making sure he didn't try to hold on longer than he should. That night, he didn't leave any food on the terrace. He filled the water bowl one last time, just in case, but he didn't replenish it when it emptied. 3 days later, the Bobcats were gone. Joseph told himself it was for the best. The Bobcats were healthy now, strong enough to survive on their own, wild enough to find their place in the desert ecosystem that had been their birthright. He had done what he could, and now it was time to let go. But the terrace felt empty in a way it never had before. He went back to his old routines: morning coffee, afternoon photography walks, evening news programs. He reconnected with his children through weekly phone calls, telling them about the storm and its aftermath, but leaving out the part about the Bobcats. He wasn't sure they would understand. Months passed. The desert healed from the cyclone's damage. New growth emerged from the wounded earth, and the saguaros that had survived began to bloom with their spectacular white flowers. Joseph was on his terrace one morning, camera in hand, trying to capture the way the early light played across the mountain ridges, when movement caught his eye. A bobcat was walking across his backyard. Not one of the young ones. This animal was larger, its coat rich and healthy, its movements confident and purposeful. But there was something familiar about it. The way it walked with a slightly wider stance on one side. The distinctive pattern of spots on its left flank. Boss? Joseph's breath caught in his throat as the bobcat approached the terrace, climbed the stairs with easy grace, and stood exactly where she and her siblings had huddled all those months ago. She looked at Joseph. He looked at her. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Boss made that soft, chirping sound, the same one she had made when she began to recognize him during those early days of recovery. And Joseph felt something break open in his chest. "Hey there," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I wondered what happened to you." Boss stayed for perhaps 20 minutes, exploring the terrace, sniffing at corners and surfaces as if reacquainting herself with a half-remembered place. Then, as quietly as she had arrived, she slipped back down the stairs and disappeared into the desert. Joseph sat down heavily on his patio chair, hands trembling. She remembered. After all these months, she remembered. That first return visit was just the beginning. Over the following years, bobcats began appearing at Joseph's property with a regularity that defied explanation. Not constantly. Sometimes months would pass without a sighting, but consistently, and always during times of stress. When a brush fire swept through the scrubland 2 miles away, Joseph found a young male bobcat, not one of his original 4, sheltering in the shade of his back stairs. When summer temperatures climbed to 115 degrees, he would sometimes see bobcats sprawled in the cool shadows of his terrace during the hottest parts of the day. When monsoon storms rolled through, bringing the flash floods that made the desert washes deadly, his property became a temporary refuge. Joseph learned to recognize individuals by their markings. He gave them names, private names that he never spoke aloud, and tracked their visits in a worn notebook. He was careful never to feed them, never to encourage prolonged stays. But he couldn't bring himself to chase them away either. His neighbors noticed. Of course they did. Margaret Wilson still lived next door, though she had stopped complaining after the first year. Even she had to admit that the bobcats Joseph attracted had never caused any problems. No pets had been harmed, no children threatened. They came, they rested, they left. "It's the strangest thing," she told Joseph one afternoon, her tone more wondering than worried. "It's like they know this is a safe place, like word got out among the bobcat community." Joseph just smiled. He had no explanation that would satisfy a logical mind. All he knew was what he observed, that the simple act of helping 4 frightened creatures during their darkest hour had created something lasting. A memory, perhaps, passed down through whatever mysterious channels connected wild animals to the landscapes they inhabited. A recognition that this particular corner of the desert, this particular human dwelling, was different. On the morning of his 70th birthday, Joseph woke before dawn as he always did, and made his way to the terrace with his coffee. The sun was just beginning to paint the Catalinas with shades of gold and pink when he saw her. Boss, older now, her muzzle showing the first hints of gray but still unmistakably herself, was sitting at the top of the stairs, watching the sunrise. She turned her head as Joseph settled into his chair, and for a moment, their eyes met. 8 years had passed since that terrible morning after the cyclone. 8 years since Joseph had found 4 mud-soaked kittens huddled against his stairwell, too weak to run. Boss had returned dozens of times in those years, sometimes alone, sometimes with other bobcats that Joseph suspected might be her offspring. She never stayed long. She never sought contact. But she kept coming back. "Morning, old girl," Joseph said softly. Boss made her chirping sound, quieter now, softer with age, and turned back to watch the sunrise. They sat together in companionable silence as the desert came alive around them. Quail calling from the scrub, a roadrunner darting across the yard, the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. Joseph thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The storm, the fear, the simple choice to help rather than turn away. He thought about all the bobcats who had passed through his life since then. The young ones, the old ones, the injured and the healthy. Each one a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion could ripple outward in ways we might never fully understand. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill. Boss stretched, yawned, and rose to her feet. She gave Joseph one last look. A look that seemed to hold something like acknowledgement, or perhaps gratitude, before descending the stairs and padding off into the brightening desert. Joseph watched her go until she disappeared among the creosote and mesquite, then lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast. "Until next time," he said. And somewhere in the wild heart of the Sonoran desert, a bobcat who remembered continued on her way, carrying with her the knowledge that some places in this world, and some people, could still be trusted. That was the gift Joseph Sikar had given, all those years ago. That was the gift that kept returning to him.